Kirstie Alley's Star Trek replacement says Leonard Nimoy is why Lt. Saavik became less emotional. Robin Curtis says that her version of Lieutenant Saavik in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, was less emotional than Kirstie Alley's because of director Leonard Nimoy. Kirstie Alley originated the role of Lt. Saavik in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, which was directed by Nicholas Meyer. Saavik was a protege of Captain Spock's, Leonard Nimoy, and she served on the USS Enterprise under Admiral James T. Kirk, William Shatner. During the conflict that resulted when Khan stole the planet-creating Genesis device, when Star Trek III, The Search for Spock's production wouldn't meet Kirstie Alley's fee to return, Robin Curtis was cast as Lt. Saavik. Along with David Marcus, Merritt Buttrick, the son of Admiral Kirk, Saavik surveyed the newly created Genesis planet, where she found Spock resurrected. Saavik helped Spock through Ponfar and kept him safe as Spock underwent a painful aging process. But after Spock was returned to Vulcan and reunited with his Katra, or Vulcan soul, Lt. Saavik remained on Vulcan at the beginning of Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home. Leonard Nimoy is why Robin Curtis's Saavik was less emotional than Kirstie Alley's in Star Trek III. Appearing on the Skyfeed Diner podcast, Robin Curtis addressed the question of why her version of Lt. Saavik in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, was less emotional than Kirstie Alley's Saavik in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan. Curtis's more cerebral Saavik was a noticeable departure, especially after Alley's Saavik cried at the death of Spock in Star Trek II. Robin explained that Star Trek III director Leonard Nimoy made Saavik more Vulcan. Read her quote and watch the Skyfeed Diner video below. I admit it was very much direction, but it was my preference to be that actor who just put herself in the hands of the King Vulcan. Who was I to go into the franchise and go, well, you know, this is what I think a Vulcan woman would do and say. I shook Mr. Nimoy's hand the first day of work and said, you seem to think I know what I'm doing, but I really don't. And he said, Robin, I'll take you every step of the way. And so, when people comment on the subtle differences or perhaps some of the more obvious differences between the two portrayals, I have to remind them, I think it's very much a collaboration between the artist and the director, for sure. Obviously, Nicholas Meyer and Kirstie kind of went to the edges of the emotion and the flirtation, and they brought some nuances to the character that Leonard Nimoy would have no part of. He didn't want me to breathe in the wrong place, as much as I tried to inject that little layer of emotion. It wasn't happening. He wasn't having it. While it was not outright stated in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, Lt. Saavik was meant to be half Vulcan and half Romulan. This explains why Kirstie Alley's portrayal of Saavik displayed myriad emotions, from an attraction to Admiral Kirk to outright grief at the death of Spock. However, Leonard Nimoy had very specific ideas about Vulcans since he originated the logical species portrayal, and Nimoy worked closely with Robin Curtis to make Lt. Saavik more Vulcan than Star Trek II director Nicholas Meyer preferred Alley to play Saavik. Lt. Saavik hasn't appeared in a Star Trek movie or TV series since Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, although Robin Curtis appeared in Star Trek The Next Generation's Gambit as the Romulan Talera. However, Star Trek Picard Season 3 delivered a long-awaited update on what happened to Saavik. According to ancillary background for Star Trek Picard Season 3 that was posted on Instagram, Saavik was promoted to captain of the USS Titan in 2293, after the events of Star Trek VI, The Undiscovered Country. Captain Saavik's Titan was even briefly the flagship of the United Federation of Planets. In the rich universe of Star Trek, few characters have sparked as much curiosity and debate as Lieutenant Saavik. Introduced in Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, Saavik was originally played by Kirstie Alley, marking her breakout role in Hollywood. Alley's portrayal of the half-Vulcan, half-Romulan officer was both fresh and memorable, delivering a more emotionally complex version of a Vulcan than fans were used to seeing. However, when the character reappeared in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, and Star Trek IV, The Voyage Home, Saavik was played by actress Robin Curtis, and fans immediately noticed a shift. Curtis's Saavik was much more restrained, presenting a far more traditional Vulcan demeanor than Alley's original interpretation. For years, fans have speculated about the reasons for this change. Recently, Curtis herself shed light on the matter, attributing the difference to one key figure in Star Trek lore, Leonard Nimoy. Curtis explained that the decision to make Saavik more emotionally controlled stemmed from Nimoy's influence during his tenure as the director of Star Trek III and Star Trek IV. Nimoy, who famously portrayed the iconic Vulcan, Spock, for decades, had a profound understanding of Vulcan culture and psychology, and he believed that Saavik's character should align more closely with the traditional Vulcan archetype, disciplined, logical, and emotionally detached. In The Wrath of Khan, Kirstie Alley's Saavik was an intriguing blend of human-like emotional responses and Vulcan stoicism. Viewers witnessed a Saavik who was visibly rattled by the violence of space battles, who shed tears for Spock after his death, and who seemed to struggle with the control of her emotions. This layered portrayal added depth to the character, leading fans to wonder about the possibilities of her half-Vulcan, half-Romulan heritage, an aspect that was hinted at but never fully explored in the film. Saavik's emotional depth, in many ways, mirrored Spock's own internal conflicts with his human and Vulcan halves, making her a compelling addition to the Star Trek universe. However, when Robin Curtis took over the role in Star Trek III, The Search for Spock, Saavik became a far more restrained character. Gone were the flashes of emotional intensity that had characterized Alley's portrayal. Instead, Curtis's Saavik was much more in line with the stoic Vulcan tradition, embodying the cool rationality that fans expected from Spock's people. The decision to shift Saavik's portrayal was a deliberate one made by Leonard Nimoy, who was not only playing Spock, but also directing the film. According to Curtis, Nimoy believed that Saavik should be a more classically Vulcan character, in line with the traits that Star Trek had established for the species. Nimoy's influence on the role makes sense in light of his deep understanding of Vulcan culture, particularly the importance of emotional control. As the actor who had spent years developing and refining Spock's character, Nimoy was intimately familiar with the nuances of Vulcan logic and their reliance on discipline to suppress emotion. Nimoy saw the character of Saavik as an opportunity to reinforce these Vulcan traits, especially in contrast to the emotional upheavals happening around her, such as the death and rebirth of Spock. Curtis has also mentioned that Nimoy's direction helped her better understand the role of a Vulcan. Before stepping into Saavik's shoes, Curtis was relatively unfamiliar with the intricacies of the Star Trek world. Working with Nimoy, she came to realize just how much restraint was required to convincingly portray a Vulcan, and she credited Nimoy with guiding her through the process of toning down Saavik's emotions. In retrospect, Nimoy's decision to steer Saavik in a more traditional Vulcan direction reflected his desire to maintain continuity in the portrayal of Vulcans across the franchise. It also served to highlight Spock's unique emotional journey by providing a stark contrast in Saavik's behavior. While Spock, who had long wrestled with his dual heritage, was increasingly embracing his human side, Saavik's more controlled demeanor in Star Trek III and Star Trek IV emphasized her commitment to the Vulcan way of life. The change in Saavik's character between the two films has led to debate among Star Trek fans. Some preferred Alley's more emotionally nuanced version of the character, arguing that it made Saavik more relatable and complex. Others appreciated Curtis's more faithful interpretation of a Vulcan officer, seeing it as more consistent with the established lore of the series. Regardless of which portrayal fans prefer, it is clear that Nimoy's guidance was instrumental in shaping the character's evolution. In many ways, the evolution of Saavik reflects the broader thematic struggles in Star Trek between logic and emotion, duty and individuality. While Kirstie Alley's